Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining me here today. I'm going to give a disclaimer to start. First, as Molly just described, it's been a very emotional 24 to 48 hours for me. I'm sorry. My purpose in this body that I live in is to make sure that my life matters. By the time I die, I want to make sure that I made a difference. And so I'm 28 years old, and being able to look back, I'm going to share chronologically these pivotal moments that I could not ignore that allowed me to step into my purpose today. And specifically, I want us to think about our roles in some of these systems. And it's very easy sometimes for us to, get so caught up in our day-to-day that we forget that our brothers and sisters all around us are suffering. Just very quickly before we begin, those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act. And so I hope that through this conversation I share with you guys today, that it will give you a sense of inspiration and, a sense of willingness to question your own role in some of these broken systems and what it is that you could be doing more of. I know what my purpose is. I hope that other folks are either on their journey to finding their purpose or have already found their purpose, and then be able to figure out how do you intersect your purpose with what our God-given right is to be a part of community and to uplift humanity and human rights. Acknowledging our space and our privilege. And so it's very important right now that I acknowledge the fact that we're able to share space with each other right now. But right now, as we speak, we have more refugees living in this world than at any other point in our global history. Right now, for the first time in documented history, we have less women occupying this planet than at any other moment because violence against women is at an all-time high. Right now, in the United States, we have 3 million people that are sitting in jail cells across the country, a lot of which have been sentenced to long terms for nonviolent offenses. And the privatization of our prison industrial complex has greatly contributed to the injustices that I will be talking about. And so I like to open up this space with us understanding the privilege of the seat that we're sitting in, the space that we're sharing with each other, and that right now there are millions upon millions of people that are seeking refuge, that are, unjustly being persecuted for things that they are innocent of, and the list goes on and on. So I'd like to start with where I came from. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, in a very diverse community in downtown Brooklyn. I was born to a mother who was an Irish Roman Catholic, whose grandparents and great-grandparents immigrated here from Ireland during the potato famine. My father's family came here from Cuba and Portugal. My father passed away when I was 9 years old. And so at 9 years old, my mother made a decision that she was going to set forth an example of opportunity and higher education. So at 9 years old, my mother went back to college. She maintained a full-time job. She went to school, and she interned full-time. And what that means for me is that I grew up in a household where I was forced to question all of these different institutional barriers around me. I was working at the age of 11 in a Dominican hair salon, which I learned how to do great hair. Thank you, Josie Reyes. And it was my first experience with being able to understand what opportunity looked like. And that from 11 to 17, I was gainfully employed consistently. I usually had multiple jobs. And so through my presentation, when I start to speak about where I come from or some obstacles that I've been able to overcome, I understand that since the age of 11, I've had other people that have invested their time and energy in me. Sally Rumble from CreativeMornings speaks so highly of me, but I must also acknowledge Sally in this space because without her, I would not be here. And Sally has been a constant source of inspiration for me as I've been on a journey the last year in figuring out how I step into my purpose more fully. The top corner picture is of my mother, my brother, and my sister. The bottom picture is of my father and myself. The picture over to your left is my mother and some of her siblings. She was one of 9. And so a lot of the themes I'll be talking about will be about racial inequality and injustice, but also about poverty and how we have these broken systems that exploit both poor folks and folks of color. So when I talk about my upbringing and I talk about all these obstacles that I was able to overcome, at the age of 16, I had a good friend of mine. His name was Angel Castro. Angel was arrested for a crime that he did not commit. He went out to a house party one night with his relatives. There was an incident that erupted outside. 2 men pulled out knives, and one of the young men lost his life. Angel was charged and convicted of manslaughter. Specifically, Angel would not release the name of the person that had committed the crime because he was directly related to them, and his family felt that because he was 16 years old, he'd get an easier break. I'll speak about it later in the presentation, but New York and North Carolina are the only 2 states still in the United States that charge 16-year-olds as adults. And so Angel sat in a jail cell. From the age of 16 to where I stand right now as a 28-year-old young woman, I understand that Angel missed out on the most important parts of his early developmental years. Last year, Angel was released, and I'm happy to say that he is trying his best to reacclimate himself to society, but I'm bringing him into this space because I understood as a 16-year-old what injustice looked like. And that was the first time that I realized that the system had failed someone that I knew and someone that I cared about. And I consistently visited Angel at Rikers Island, behind my mother's back, of course, from the ages of 18 to 21. And so in 2006, I was recruited after I graduated from high school to an equal opportunity program at the State University of New York College at Oneonta. And so what that meant for me is that my GPA wasn't very high, but I was very involved in extracurricular activities, and I had to go to college. My mother, setting this example for me at 11 years old, held a high bar that no matter what I did, I had to make sure I went to college because that would be one of the only opportunities for me to make sure that our family emerged from poverty. And so in 2007, this is a picture of me, actually 2006, this is a picture of me sitting in my summer academy seat. The Equal Opportunity Program through SUNY Oneonta was an opportunity for young urban students and young people of color to be able to access a program where we got additional support and resources. Specifically, they made us do a 6-week summer academy that was more like a boot camp. They woke us up every morning at 6 a.m. They made us do intense reading and English and math, trying to make sure that we were prepared for what we would face on that campus entering the fall semester. Understanding the value of my seat. When I got to Oneonta, I was explained things on a different level, where they told me these injustices that I would be faced with in the community of Oneonta because it was in the outskirts of upstate New York, where people still proudly flew Confederate flags. And that because of the way I looked, or because of the way that I talked, or because of the fact that I moved my hands a lot, or that I spoke Spanglish to my peers, that I could be targeted by folks from the community. And so in that same sense, I sat in that seat, and I was explained that that same seat in my college classroom was made by an inmate at a state correctional facility. Because in New York State, they use cheap prison labor to make sure that our state institutions are funded with things that they need at very cheap costs. So although I paid tuition for my seat, my institution was able to cut contracts with correctional facilities for the goods that were all over my campus. And understanding that I had a friend that was being exploited while I was being given an opportunity to sit in that same seat and learn how to progress and how to begin to take advantage of opportunities. Oneonta was very difficult for me. My first semester, I was called a spick twice. I was asked if I had my papers by a strange-looking man in army fatigues at Walmart, and I was constantly feeling like I was being targeted by my peers. I understand that I may benefit from white privilege because of the way that I look, but being in an environment where I had thick black curly hair and I spoke the way I did, I stuck out like a sore thumb. My first semester, I'm sitting in my classroom, and the professor's going around the room asking people, what do you want to do after you graduate? What would you like to do after you graduate? What would you like to do after you graduate? And of course, I sat in my own silos with other students from the Equal Opportunity Program. So my black sister's sitting to the right of me, and she's from the Bronx, and she says, I'm gonna go to law school. And the professor responds, you should rethink that because black women don't go to law school. And I sat there and my heart dropped. I couldn't speak. And I couldn't understand why we sat through summer academy all summer. We sat in that classroom. We were the only 2 students that were from New York City. We were the only 2 students that identified ourselves as women of color, and that he had the right to speak to us in that manner. So when I did my research, I found out that Oneonta had experienced their own issues around racial equality and equity. In 1992, they had something called the Blacklist. The Blacklist was an incident where an older white woman said that a young black man, average height, average weight, broke into her home. She said that he must have cut himself on the door as he tried to illegally enter. And so the Oneonta police went to Hartwick College, which was a college right next to Oneonta State, and they asked for a list of all of their black and Latino students. Hartwick College said, absolutely not. That is a violation of our students' civil rights. Oneonta police went to SUNY Oneonta, and SUNY Oneonta issued them a list of every single black and Latino student. The state police then proceeded to harass and question and intimidate and use abusive tactics on undergraduate students that were just there trying to get an education, just trying to pull their families out of poverty, just trying to hold on to an opportunity of a higher education. And so this picture is of the students in 1992 on my campus protesting the Blacklist. And it's something that no one ever spoke about, no one ever explained to me, and I had to find out through an annual anniversary where we had a vigil for the students that were deeply impacted by the Blacklist. So understanding how diversity was an issue in Oneonta, I felt like I had to create my own community, and I had to figure out how I was gonna make Oneonta work for me. And so I joined a sorority that changed my life. It was the only minority multicultural sorority on our campus, Mu Sigma Upsilon Sorority Incorporated, Mujeres Siempre Unidas. It stands for, in Spanish, Women Always United. And so the picture on the bottom is of my founding sisters that founded that chapter in 2005, the other sisters that joined in spring 2006, and myself. My undergraduate orientation process to my sorority taught me a lot of things, specifically because they use a militant process of pledging, right? And what that taught me was how to channel my culture, how to channel where I came from, and how to channel this community and this sisterhood that I was gonna use as my strength in times where I was weak. The flyers you see on the top were my way of fighting back. In 2008, when Zeitgeist was a new documentary and everyone was talking about it, we hosted several screenings where we were trying to have these intersectional conversations about what the real world was gonna be like once we left Oneonta. The other flyers of a Healthcare in America program that we hosted, where we spoke about how the increased charges on health insurance and the gaps of the people left behind were creating these systems where poor folks were dying of conditions that could be treated in our own communities. And I look back, and this is 8 years later, and these are still very relevant issues that have not been addressed. So I did what I could do at SUNY Oneonta, and I made the decision that I felt I had to leave the campus. I transferred to SUNY New Paltz, which was a campus that was about 2 hours south of Oneonta. It was also only about an hour and a half from New York City, so it gave me the opportunity to be able to be closer to my family. It also was a lot more diverse, and it gave me the opportunity to indulge myself in other things, where I was able to take advantage of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health, which was a program that I graduated with a minor through. Through that program, the summer before I graduated, I took a service trip to Alabama. In spring of 2011, Alabama was hit with 24 tornadoes that tore through their state and killed dozens of people. I decided to take this newfound program and new knowledge of dealing with folks with PTSD to the devastation that was currently occupying Anniston and Webster's Chapel. And this was a picture of a house that was still being occupied. That corner right there, there was an older man named Boone who was very, very proud. He wouldn't ask anyone for resources. FEMA didn't give him anything, the Red Cross didn't serve him with anything, and he threw an awning over the top of that enclosure in the back, and he continued to live there and sleep there. I was there in August, and the tornadoes had happened in April, and he was still living right there. And so what does that say about us as people? What does that say about the resources that we have that we don't take care of our own? And what does this mean when we look at people that are inflicted with such poverty that they're literally voiceless and invisible. That to me sounds like a broken system, when we know that there are billions of dollars that are fed into FEMA and fed into the Red Cross and fed into the United Way, and somehow there's men like Boone that can sit here and not be served. Right after I graduated in December 2011, I was given an amazing opportunity by one of my sorority sisters to interview for a position at the historic Riverside Church. Riverside Church sits in Morningside Heights in Harlem. It was founded by the Rockefeller family almost 100 years ago, and with a deep investment portfolio, they committed themselves to racial justice and equality and change. And so although I experienced a lot of issues around the bureaucracy of such a large institution, I was able to run 17 different program areas where I was able to involve the congregation, people that cared, people that showed up to church every week, people that wanted to be a part of a better community, and how do we work together to solve some of these pending issues. The picture you see on the left was my first program where I packed the house with 2,500 people. The speakers at that program were Angela Davis, civil rights freedom fighter, Michelle Alexander, who's written the book The New Jim Crow, and Cornel West, who is a political activist and probably one of my favorite commentaries. And so Riverside taught me a lot of things. Specifically, it taught me that no one will change things unless you take the opportunities to change them yourself. If you are willing to lead, if you have the courage to lead, that people will follow if they feel morally inclined to. In 2012, a year after I started, I got a phone call from a reverend in the Bronx who relayed to me a devastating story of what happened to a young man in the Bronx. On February 2nd, 2012, Ramarley Graham was walking home from a corner store in the Bronx. His community was being targeted through a new program where they incited dozens of stops and frisks on young black men, and we call it broken windows policing, where they give infractions and they arrest young people for things like jaywalking, spitting, riding your bike on the sidewalk, all as a part of trying to make the community better. These things actually target communities in ways where people are given tickets, where they usually can't pay the fines. They're then issued warrants for their arrests, and oftentimes these young people or folks that are poor end up in Rikers Island with bails that they can't afford. And that doesn't sound like community policing. That sounds like people being targeted because of race. It sounds like people being targeted because of poverty. And so Ramarley's story is unique because he was walking home from the corner store. He entered his home, and a few minutes later, the police ran into his home and shot him in his bathroom in front of his 6-year-old little brother, Chinor. That's Chinor right there. And so when we talk about injustice and what injustice looks like, it looks like that same evening that Ramarley was killed, his mother showed up to the house and the police denied her access and information. She overheard that her son was killed by sitting in the police station, overhearing 2 cops talking about how Richard just messed up. They kept her 82-year-old grandmother and questioned her for hours without access to a lawyer. And for several days, they denied her access to Ramarley's body, hoping that they wouldn't be able to conduct their own autopsy because then she'd be forced to begin her burial proceedings. That same night, the police commissioner came on the news and said that Ramarley was running from the police, and that gave them hot pursuit clauses where they could illegally enter his house without a search warrant because he was running. The following day, Ramarley Graham's family issued a surveillance video taken from a house next door that showed Ramarley just walking into his house like nothing happened, and a few minutes later, the police breaking down his door. Every single week, I rode the train an hour and a half to the Bronx, and I helped his mother organize Ramarley's call. If you'd like to donate or if you'd like to find out more information about her case and her fight for justice, you can find her at Ramarley's Call on Facebook and all of the other social media platforms. I bring her into this space specifically because recently, Richard Haste, again, we were denied justice. He was indicted. He was never convicted. Richard Haste is still serving the New York Police Department, making 6 figures of my tax dollars. The city turned around and they settled with Ramarley Graham's family for $3 million, but Ramarley will never come back, and we will continue to have issues around injustices like this until officers are held accountable. Richard Haste is one of dozens of officers that I can bring up in this space specifically that have never been charged for their crimes. Specifically, I'd like to bring up Daniel Pantaleo, who we have on video suffocating Eric Garner. Daniel Pantaleo was never indicted, he was never charged, and chokeholds are seen as an illegal police tactic in New York City. But again, there's been no accountability, and right now, Daniel Pantaleo is costing New York City $500,000 a year. He's making $100,000 himself on desk duty, and he has a $400,000 security team that the NYPD pays for to keep him safe from New Yorkers who are still angry and upset about this injustice. Principles of religion, principles of community, and principles of humanity. And so through my work at Riverside, I constantly engaged our interfaith leaders in the fact that they could do more. That if they're leading congregations of people, what does it mean to be a faith leader? What does it mean to be so devoted to your religion if you're not devoted to the principles of justice and humanity for all? When I worked with interfaith leaders, I was so incredibly moved to learn about all the different principles of Islam and Judaism, all of these other religions that I had no idea about because I grew up as a Roman Irish Catholic. And the idea that we have systems that take up so much space and that we have churches all over our country that do not embrace the principles of dignity and humanity, and instead they focus on hate. They create silos among their congregations, and they promote propaganda and hate. And specifically at this moment in time, we have a shift where we have a lot of folks that are part of the religious conservative communities that are supporting Donald Trump. And we know what he stands for, and we know the racism that he speaks, and we know the Islamophobia and the bigotry that comes with him. And so I urge you that if you are part of a community of such, that you challenge your faith leaders, because once I challenged mine, I was able to lead them into the halls of Congress where they laid down on the cafeteria floors in front of Congress demanding justice. I was able to lead them through the streets of Staten Island with posters that represented all the families that I had personally spoken to that lost their children unjustly through broken systems. Trayvon is the only one listed on that sign above that was not killed by local law enforcement. Specifically, Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. was in his 60s and he accidentally set off his life alert. When the police arrived, he told the police, "I don't need you, I'm fine, I just set off my life alert by accident." He had a heart condition, a pre-existing heart condition. What ensued after was disgusting. The officers would not leave. They continuously were making racial slurs outside the door that were recorded. And they ended up breaking down the door. They said that Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. lunged at them, which was impossible because the man could barely make it a few feet without having to sit down because of his heart condition. They said that they shot him with a beanbag and he still continued to lunge, and so then they had to shoot him. We know that that was not true. There's evidence that shows that that was not what actually happened, and still there was no justice and accountability in Kenneth Chamberlain Sr.'s case. And I specifically made sure I put a picture of him in the service to remind us that he served our country and how disgustingly our country served him in the last moments of his life. In 2014, I'm going to start to get emotional because a lot of this brings back a lot of emotions. In 2014, we know what happened in Ferguson. Well, let me correct that. I know what happened in Ferguson. The media perpetuates propaganda where they're telling people things that are not true. The young people in Ferguson saw that they were being targeted by broken window style policing. They knew that they were being issued tickets to create revenue streams for the city, and that only black and brown people were being targeted. After Michael Brown was killed, they said enough was enough and they took to the streets. Unfortunately, our country doesn't acknowledge young people that are trying to change our communities for the better. Instead, there's governmental programs that exist where local law enforcement was able to obtain military-grade equipment to use against innocent, unarmed civilians that were conducting street protests. That is a symbol of the times. The billions of dollars that we're investing in war overseas, once we pull back our troops, those same tanks, those same Black Hawk choppers, and those same AR-15s are being given to our local law enforcement without oversight, accountability, or additional training. What I know that had happened in Ferguson was a complete injustice. Sirens being turned on, forcing people to flee the streets because they couldn't even hear themselves think. They threw flash grenades at young people that were just assembling. There were safe spaces that were set up at community centers and churches, and the police consistently and constantly ransacked them. They were beaten, they were pushed back, and day after day, they pushed back against the police. When we saw things lit on fire and we heard the media promoting propaganda that these young people are tearing up their communities, the young people felt like that wasn't their community to begin with. If they couldn't walk down the street and feel safe, it wasn't theirs. And how did they create a space where people would understand what was happening? And we know that the federal investigation into what happened in Ferguson told us exactly what was happening in Ferguson and what is exactly happening in multiple cities throughout our country. Exploitation of black and brown people, exploitation of the poor. That's Tara standing next to me. Tara's from Hands Up United. She's one of the first organizers that worked with Michael Brown's family, and she's a resident of Ferguson. She runs a group called Hands Up United now, where they have weekly and monthly sessions with young people called Breakfast and Books. And I mention these titles and these names because I hope that you feel engaged enough to look up their work on social media and feel the work that they do for their community. And that when people show these things on the news, they're not showing the stories of Tara and the dozens of other community groups that were founded right after the Ferguson uprising to address the needs of the community. Me feeling like I should do more and I had to do more, I decided to take on a summer youth employment program through the Riverside Church. Originally, I was told, you will have no internal support, Carlene. We will not give you any additional funding, Carlene. And you know, young urban kids can be a handful, Carlene. And I looked back at them and said, I remember what I was like at 16. I get it, it's fine, I'll do it. And so when I first began the application process, I didn't get prior approval because I didn't care. I felt like if they told me no, I would just shame them among the congregation to get them to say yes. And I knew that I had a summer ahead of me that I wanted to make sure I engaged young people to give them the knowledge I knew that I had that would help them be more successful. I conducted summer youth employment for 3 years. The young people I worked with, I am still very connected to. And specifically identifying the macro level issues and how they affect these young people on a micro level became a part of their daily existence now. Elanam, who's standing right next to me right there, his family, he also was born in Ghana. He came here as a young child through a visa program, and his family was very wealthy, and they were fine in Ghana. The only reason why his family came here was because his parents thought that he'd have access to a better education here. And when they moved to the Bronx, the idea that they had to work multiple jobs just to survive, that the gaps between the rich and the poor in my city are astronomical, and that rents and housing are almost unaffordable. Elanam is now he's entering his sophomore year. He goes to Wesley in West Virginia, and he told me that the summer youth employment program changed his life. Once he understood the institutions of racism, he was no longer angry at people individually. He was angry at the systems that have been created. If someone called him the N-word in West Virginia, he no longer wanted to incite an incident or respond in conflict. Instead, he internalized it and he understood that that person was ignorant and that they were just one piece of this larger system that needs to change. The bottom picture is a picture of some of my young people with one of the freedom riders from the civil rights movement. I had people come in and speak to the young people about the need for us to continue to carry the torches that they laid the foundation on. Mrs. Maggabee sat in a cell for a week and conducted a hunger strike after she was trying to integrate the buses in the South. The picture on the top is one of the many campaigns I had my young people lead, specifically around the Fight for 15. We hear on national headlines that the Fight for 15 is successful, and it's been implemented in Seattle. New York is now beginning discussions about implementing it. And it's because for the last 5 years, there's been people that have been engaging in campaigns to try and make this a reality. It starts with all of us. It doesn't start with the institutions and governmental agencies doing the work. They only respond to the public pressure that we apply. And the idea that, once again, we're talking about macro, micro level issues, and I had to explain to my young people that institutions like McDonald's, having a conversation, don't use your money at McDonald's. Instead, go to your local bodega and buy a sandwich. McDonald's exploits us and is a part of a system of exploitation because they get tax breaks. Through their tax breaks, they then pay people less than a living wage. They exploit their workers on a number of different levels. And most of their workers, especially in New York State, qualify for Medicaid and food stamps. So now my tax dollars are going towards McDonald's workers who are not getting paid a fair wage from a company that gets millions and billions of dollars of tax breaks. That sounds like a broken system. And now I'm happy to say that most of my young people don't eat at McDonald's. We can go on and on and on about the injustice of Rikers Island. If anyone's familiar with our jail and our prison, there's multiple issues of human rights violations that have went unaddressed. The top picture is a faith delegation that visited the island in 2013 after the new Commissioner Ponte took on his new role there. In a private conversation I had with Commissioner Ponte around solitary confinement, he said that the Correctional Association was such a problem and that the officers would not change, and he was not receiving the support he needed to make the changes he needed to make. This is still an issue. Last week, Norman Seabrook, who runs the Correctional Association in New York State, was indicted for taking $20 million from the investment portfolio of correctional officers and investing it in an Israeli company. And so when we're talking about the intersectionality of injustice, I know how my Arab American, Palestinian brothers and sisters are being treated in New York specifically. And I now see the direct intersect of how our government and how our corrupt officials are perpetuating these problems. The bottom picture is a picture of Khalif Broder. I worked with his family specifically as well. He was 16 years old when he was arrested for stealing a book bag. He sat in a jail cell in Rikers Island for 3 years. If you Google Khalif Broder, you'll be disturbed to see on YouTube multiple videos of him being violently attacked by other inmates and guards. A 16-year-old sitting in Rikers Island for 3 years because his family could not afford the bail. And when he was told by his legal counsel to take a plea deal, he said, absolutely not. I did not steal a book bag, and I am not guilty. When he was finally released, after it made national media news that this young person had been arrested for stealing a book bag, and had never received a fair day in court, he was released. Upon his release, there were multiple donors that stepped up, and they donated to further his education, and he had a free ride to Bronx Community College. Unfortunately, Khalif Broder killed himself recently, therefore, after not being able to cope with the extreme violence that he experienced at Rikers. All of this public pressure mounting, I began volunteering with the group called the Gathering for Justice, which was an organization founded by civil rights legend Harry Belafonte. An initiative of the Gathering for Justice was the Justice League. It was a group of young people that came together to protest all of these injustices around our communities and specifically around police accountability. Carmen Perez, who's the executive director, along with two wonderful women, Linda Sarsour, who's currently a delegate for the Bernie Sanders camp. She's the first hijabi Muslim to be a delegate in our election process. She's also the first hijabi Muslim to be invited into the spin room after a debate. And so we have women that are occupying space all around us, that are leading by example, and that are questioning the status quo and are pushing the barriers for women that will come after them. Another woman that led our March to Justice was Tamika Mallory, who is a civil rights leader in our community as well. And so the March to Justice was a 250-mile journey where we stepped off in Staten Island, the same place where Eric Garner was suffocated and murdered by the police. And we walked 25 miles a day on Route 1 from Staten Island all the way to Washington, D.C. The picture there is at one of our stop points where you just have to take in the moment that you just walked 20 miles and you maybe had 3 or 5 more ahead of you. We were sponsored on this journey by 1199 SEIU Labor Union. They sent a RV of nurses with us that tended to our blisters in our feet every moment of every day. We also had an advance team supported by 1199 SEIU where they set up aero mattresses in every single place that we slept. That was the first time I experienced what a real community felt like and what it felt like to question my own beliefs about systems and prejudgments I had myself against other people. I had learned a little bit about Islam, but I had never been inside a mosque. And the beauty of March to Justice was that each night we slept in a different city, sharing fellowship with different communities, being hosted by different institutions. We slept at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, which was one of the first designated universities, one of the first historically black institutions. Beyond that, it was on the route of the Underground Railroad, and what that meant for us to share space at that institution. We slept in a mosque in Philadelphia, where we were followed by drone cameras, where people drove so close to us that they could have knocked us off the road as we were walking single file on Route 9 because police would not allow escorts to lead or follow us on certain roads through their counties. People threw black smoke at us, people called us the N-word, and we experienced some of the most disgusting instances that you can have and encounters you can have with your fellow Americans. The beauty of March to Justice was that we each pledged ourselves to continue to bring someone else's name into the spaces, as each night we hosted rallies in different cities. And so I carried with me Ramarley's name. The below picture is one of our first stops in, I believe we were in Newark, and the community greeted us in a, fantastic style. We had a bonfire and there was a speak out. Each opportunity we had to engage with the community about why it was important that we marched changed my life, and I know it changed other people's lives around the route. We were in Baltimore, sitting in a church, in Pastor Jamal Bryant's church in Baltimore, when we heard that Freddie Gray had succumbed to his injuries. Again, I keep mentioning these pivotal points because nothing in life is a coincidence. When Freddie Gray died, we exited the church and we sat on the pavement and we cried. We cried and we cried. Because although we were so close to Washington, D.C., we could not ignore that the reason why we marched was continuing to happen around us, and that every single day people were dying, and every single day people ignored it. The picture to the left is a community mural that we helped paint, and we helped fund. We helped with multiple murals through an organization, Beats, Rhymes, and Relief. One of my good friends, Ramin from Beats, Rhymes, and Relief, he's from Baltimore, works with community projects specifically around trying to make sure that young people have opportunities. Making sure that he hosts an annual back to school day where he gives free haircuts to kids, backpacks, and school supplies. Things like that matter. When a young person can walk into their classroom on the first day of school and be able to feel confident because they have the resources that they need. They have the books and the pencils and the pens and the sharpener, and they have a haircut, and they have clean school clothes. When we got back from the March to Justice, the purpose was that we traveled with the Justice Package, which was 3 pieces of federal legislation that we wanted to pass, specifically around racial profiling and divesting our resources and a lot of the armed militia that we were speaking about. So it was essentially a demilitarization of local law enforcement bill. When we got back to New York, it was the beginning of the Baltimore uprising as we knew it. We were in Baltimore and we were at the precinct when people first found out that Freddie Gray was killed. And once we had to leave and continue on our march, we kept those people with us every single day. When we got back to New York City, we hosted a huge rally in Union Square, New York City, where we were calling all of our brothers and sisters from New York City to stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters from Baltimore. That night, I have a video of me standing on the sidewalk and an NYPD police officer after 6 hours of us marching. We started on 14th Street and 5th Avenue. 3 hours later, I had 300 people behind me, and I was standing on 59th Street and 12th Avenue. We were ready to take the artery of New York City, the West Side Highway. We were going to lay down our bodies and risk arrest because we know that the only way that our mayor and our city would pay attention is if it cost them an astronomical amount of money. And so by shutting down the West Side Highway, by shutting down the arteries that lead to the bridges and the tunnels that create revenue for our city, people will listen to us. People will ask us what we're doing, and people will answer our calls when we call their offices and make these demands that we're making. That same night, I'm standing on the sidewalk. They knew that I was one of the leaders of our group. They knew what my intention was. And so this officer, I'm still standing there exercising my First Amendment right because I had not done anything wrong yet, grabs me by my neck and yanks me off of the sidewalk, and I disappear into a sea of blue. That night, I was held in a cell for 14 hours. I was denied water for the first 6. And then after I was released with a desk appearance ticket, the officers joked that I would have been released quicker had I been arrested for drugs than for protesting. New York City recently began a new task force where it's made to tend to protesters and terrorists. And so when I'm thinking about community policing or the fact that I pay a great deal of money in taxes to live in my city, I think it's highly problematic that we have institutions that are set up and officers that are trained to deal with terrorists the same way that they're to deal with peaceful protesters. And so that picture is of the press conference that happened the day after 125 of us were arrested. 125 peaceful protesters. Fighting for families, the injustice of our immigration system. So a lot of the work I had done previously was around Black Lives Matter. I bring a lot of that knowledge into the space now when I'm trying to make sure that we're representing the lives of Black immigrants as well as every other immigrant that's represented in our struggle. Historically and specifically because Black immigrants are targeted through a lot of the racist policing tactics and other institutions that operate around us. And so it's important to highlight that right now there's 11.5 million people estimated to be living in this country out of status. What does that mean? That means that we haven't had a program of mass citizenship since the 1980s, and what that has caused is that there's no legal pathways for folks to obtain citizenship. So when people say the word illegal, that's incorrect. Let's challenge ourselves to make sure we're not perpetuating these same issues by targeting our brothers and sisters and realize that they're just undocumented and that is a status. That is a status that's held by our government. In 2012, President Obama created a program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, acknowledging that young people that came here as children by no choice of their own needed to have access to a social security number to be able to acclimate themselves to the American dream, to be able to access a college education, to be able to get a job, and to be able to prosper here in the United States. That program benefited over 700,000 young people nationally. And so in order to try and address the problem that a lot of folks were still not eligible for the DACA program, President Obama in 2014, because Congress would not pass comprehensive immigration reform, created an executive order for 2 programs. An expanded DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and a DAPA program, Deferred Action for Parental Arrivals. That meant that if you were a parent and you had a child that was a U.S. citizen, that you'd be able to apply for deferred action from deportation, because it makes no sense to deport a parent when their child is a U.S. citizen and has every right to be in this country. There's no legal pathway right now for parents to apply for citizenship who have children that are U.S. citizens. And until we address that, we will consistently have communities living in fear, people being targeted by the police, and people being denied basic human dignity. In January of this year, we had a win, a small win. And so when President Obama presented these executive actions, Texas tried to, they presented an injunction on the case saying that it was unconstitutional for the president to create these programs. It is within the president's power to address the needs of our country if Congress is not willing to move. And I'm pretty sure everyone's seen the bipartisan mess that is this conversation around gun control. And these same people that are blocking legislation around gun control are the same people that are the opposition to our Black communities, are the same people that are the opposition to our immigrant justice, and are the same people that are perpetuating these same injustices. And so after the injunction, we filed for the Supreme Court to take the case, and in January, the Supreme Court took the case. On April 18th, this is a picture of a number of people that I mobilized. We brought 700 people from New York City to Washington, D.C. to make sure that the Supreme Court heard our voice. That's Sophie Cruz. Sophie Cruz is 6 years old, and she spoke on April 18th in front of thousands of people, begging for relief for her parents because her and her little sister are U.S. citizens, but her parents are living out of status. And Sophie deserves to live with her parents to wake up every morning to her mother without the fear that someone will enter her home in the middle of the night and rip her parents from her. Yesterday, we got news that we lost our Supreme Court case by a deadlock vote 4-4. When the Supreme Court votes 4-4, it reverts back to the lower court decision, which means that the injunction still stands. Pamela Chamba works for Forward US, which is a tech company founded by Mark Zuckerberg to try and address the issues around our broken immigration system, specifically to make sure that we're able to provide visas for folks trying to travel here internationally to help build infrastructure around our tech communities. Pamela is a DACA recipient. Pamela's family are still living out of status. Her parents still live in fear of deportation. And yesterday, as soon as we heard the ruling, I called Pamela and I was like, Pamela, I am so sorry. We fought so hard and we will continue to fight. And she posted this on Facebook last night, and I texted her this morning and told her I was thinking about her and I was going to bring her into this space with me. And it says, look me in the eyes and tell me you want me gone. Look me in the eyes and tell me separating families, separating friends and neighbors is the best policy your immigration system can come up with. It's a new world, and it's time you know this is what an American family looks like. And so people talk about illegals and people talk about folks that are living out of status as if they are not our neighbors, as if they are not the people that provide important services in every infrastructure that we have in our communities. In New York State specifically, we have farm workers through the state of New York that pick our food, that sell our food. Undocumented people that work in every single restaurant, in every single borough, in every single town in our state. But we can look at those people in the eye and say, you are good enough to make my food, you are good enough to clean my house, you are good enough to babysit my children, but you are not good enough to be equal, and you are not good enough to have access to the same opportunity that I have. And that's a problem. I Am an Immigrant campaign. I challenge you all to look it up. We had Kerry Washington, Lupita Nyong'o, a bunch of celebrities come forward and support our plight during the month of June, where we were highlighting immigrant heritage stories, because this is Immigrant Heritage Month, in hopes that people would be moved to pressure the Supreme Court to push our case. This is yesterday in front of the Supreme Court. This is an advocate from United We Dream, which is an organization that serves young people living out of status. And specifically, before I hit this stage, someone from the audience came to me and said that they're a mentor to a young man that just recently found out, after he urged this young man to get a summer job, that he's actually undocumented. And so for us to understand that status is not something that we talk about, that there are millions of young people that are in school right now and don't know that they're undocumented. And they won't know that they're undocumented until someone asks them for a social security number. And a lot of young people are not even presented that situation until they're applying for college. My tips to changing the world: divest, reinvest, and repeat. I mentioned previously about my own issues, about what I invest my time and money in, specifically around the idea that I was a part of this larger macro system where I was investing, where other people were investing my money in companies that exploit my fellow brothers and sisters. I challenge you, if you have an investment portfolio, if you have a retirement fund, ask if your funds that you put your money in are socially responsible. Ask them where the money goes. Anywhere you spend your money, ask where the money goes. Support local businesses, support men and women of color, figure out ways where you create opportunities and positions and employment for other people you know are targeted by our unjust, broken systems. Currently, I just recently built a silk screen printer in my apartment. I also have photography equipment, I have microphone, and I'm trying to create a shared space in my apartment where I can employ young people, both documented and undocumented, to help create campaigns for change. If I spend $2,000 with the t-shirt company, why not spend $2,000 in my young people? This is not going to happen tomorrow. This is not going to happen next week. It's not going to happen next month. I hope that this conversation was the first step in you understanding that whatever it is that you do, You can be an investment banker. You can be a digital marketing media consultant. You can be doing anything. But unless you're giving your time and energy to collective efforts to changing some of these injustices, then you too are a part of the problem. Because you may not have a friend like Pamela, or you may not have a neighbor like little Sophie, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be involved and equally invested in their liberation and their freedom. After I left Riverside Church, for 8 months I traveled the country and I worked on a number of campaigns. I helped assemble 350 families that lost their children to police brutality to assemble in Washington, D.C. for the 20th anniversary of the Million Man March. Right after, I tattooed freedom on my arm with my pulse and with a heart. Because I want to remember every single day that I have the privilege of being free, that my status is not a problem, my skin color is not a problem to society at large, and that I've been able to obtain the education, the networks, and the resources that I need to be able to take care of myself. And with that, I need to figure out, how do I create space and opportunity for other people to have that same benefit when I know what they're up against? And how can you look at all of these young people and say that they don't matter? Some of the young people in this picture are undocumented. Some of them come from poor backgrounds. Some of them don't. Does that mean that any of them should be treated differently? Showing up literally and figuratively. Part of the reason why I have taken on a lot of this work in my free time and I'm here with you all today is because that's Jayla. That's my partner's daughter. Me and my partner were high school sweethearts. Life took us in our two separate ways, and we got back together 3 years ago when he already had a 2-year-old. And so I'm Jayla's stepmother, and I take that position on freely. And I understand that she's gonna grow up as a young woman of color, and she's gonna have obstacles that institutions have created for her, and that I have to help her navigate over and through. And I have to show up, because her life depends on it. And I challenge you all. She's not biologically mine, but the saying that it takes a village to raise a child should mean something to all of us, and the communities that we create among each other, and the roles we take on with other people's children. Thank you, everyone, for your time.